Good evening and welcome to Bible study for Wednesday, the 10th of November of 2021. I'm Reverend James Merriam, and welcome to this time of reflection and devotion and contemplation. We've been doing this Bible study remote here on NEK TV and on YouTube really since for more than a year now. This sort of started up pretty shortly after the start of the pandemic to be sort of a companion to our remote worship, and it continued over the summer. Because of this great accessibility and this great outreach, and that we can be together in this way and reflect in this way, and do this devotion together in this way in whatever time and whatever place we find able and convenient. I know people have used this in all kinds of different times during the day, as sort of like a podcast, as sort of like a wind down time, and it's been really wonderful. In the last couple of weeks, unfortunately, we have had to return to remote worship. We haven't been able to gather together in person on Sunday mornings. And so this has sort of returned to that earlier role that it had as being a bit of a companion to remote worship. This in the midweek and that on the weekend, together reflecting something of where we stand as a community in one way and in another. And especially now, being able to present different parts of the lectionary, different pieces of scripture that otherwise we would not perhaps be able to. That's what I do say just about every week about why we're doing this. This week I'm bringing this up. Hello. This week I'm bringing this up because it's an especially pertinent and noteworthy piece of scripture. Perhaps not pertinent and noteworthy and relevant exactly to our everyday lives or the situation that we're in right now, but it is a piece of scripture that gets quite a bit of attention in certain circles because it's so dramatic. It's so it's so open to interpretation. It's so bold. It has such large and significant language, and it's one that in certain circles is given a lot of importance. It's because we're going to be reading the very end of the book of Daniel, which is an apocalypse that we include in the Old Testament. It's the only book in Scripture that was written in what is Jesus's actual language, Jesus's lingua franca, Jesus's language for his preaching and his ministry. Though, of course, it's not about Jesus, not even a little bit. It was written about 200 years before Jesus, and it's rare, very, very rare, in especially in the Old Testament, that we really have quite a precise definition of when Daniel was written. And it's written clearly as an apocalypse, but as a creative sort of metaphor, similar to the Book of Revelations, using heavily coded language to speak about a particular political situation that is going on. And it's pretty clear what that political situation is. It's problems that the new kingdom of Judea is having with their Greek Hellenistic overlords, and that can be corroborated with the historical record. And so we know almost exactly that this was in the late 160s BC, so just about 200 years. Hello. Almost exactly 200 years before Jesus' ministry, putting Jesus' ministry in about the year 30 AD. So almost exactly 200 years earlier, using this heavily coded and disguised language to talk about a political situation, and using really dramatic language to do it. It's not a book of prophecy. It's not a book really about instruction. It's an apocalypse. It's not really put forward to be directive like the books of the prophets are. It's really quite different, though there's some similarity, especially in terms of the dramatic language. There's an extent to which the Hebrew prophets want to sort of play with words. They want to be clever. There really isn't that in Daniel. To some extent, the language is sort of clumsy in the original, or as best as it can be translated. But it is the kind of document that we've actually, that was a strange and by itself document for a long time. And perhaps that's why it was given so much credence as being a prediction of the end of the world. And that by careful interpretation of Daniel, much like by careful interpretation of Revelations, generation after generation of apocalyptic pastors have made a fool of themselves trying to match the events to their own events and predict the end of the world. Now, it's included in the lectionary, I think, for a pretty clear reason, because this is paired with Jesus' talking about the end of the world, and Jesus is especially saying that you cannot possibly know or predict, speaking to the disciples, when the end will happen. This is known only to the Father, and there are going to be a lot of dramatic signs and events and things going on, but those are not indicative that we are on a particular or inexorable course towards the end of the world, towards the end times. There is a similar line in Daniel that we'll go past, though it goes by pretty fleetingly and has been ignored many, many times. And even in Daniel itself, there's a strange, since this is the last chapter of Daniel, chapter 12, that we will be reading, there's even what seem to perhaps be postscripts adding on at the end of the book, basically as a response to the fact that the world didn't end as what had been earlier predicted. That's the best guess, though others put great amounts of time and attention into trying to interpret this change in numbers that's given right at the end. So the lectionary calls for us to read. She is not very happy down there. Sorry about that. Well, hey, it's okay. It's okay. We're going to read chapter 12 from the book of Daniel. This is certainly the last piece of the Old Testament to be written. And it's not that it's the last piece of scripture to be written before the birth of Jesus, not by any means. It's the last document from before the birth of Jesus that made it into the last words from before the birth of Jesus that made the cut to be canonized, to be added into the sort of set prescribed Bible. So, chapter 12, book of Daniel. And in that time, Michael shall stand up, the great prince, who stands over the sons of your people, and it shall be a time of distress, the likes of which has not been since the nation came to be until that time. And in that time your people shall escape, all who are found in the book. And many of the sleepers in the dust shall awake, some for everlasting life, and some for disgrace and everlasting shame. And the discerning shall shine like the splendor of the sky, and those who guide the many to be righteous, like the stars forever and ever. As for you, Daniel, conceal the words and seal the book till the end time. Many shall roam about, and knowledge shall abound. And I, Daniel, saw, and, look, 2 others were standing, one on the bank of the river, and one on that bank of the river. And one said to the man dressed in linen, who was over the water of the river, Until when is the wondrous end? And I heard the man dressed in linen, who was over the water of the river, and he raised his right hand and his left hand up towards the heavens, and he swore by the one who lives forever that the appointed time of times and a half, and at the end of the shattering of the power of the holy people, and these things shall be finished. And I heard and did not understand, and I said, My Lord, what is the aftermath of these things? And he said, Go, Daniel, for the words are concealed and sealed till the end time. Many shall be sifted and purified and purged, and the wicked shall act wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the discerning shall understand. And from the time the daily offering was taken away, and the desolating abomination was set up, is a 2,290 days. Happy who waits and reaches 1,335 days. As for you, go to the end, and you shall rest and stand up for your destiny at the end of days. So we have a couple of phrases that have come to mean to talk about the end time, but that in the original, in both the Koine Greek and the Aramaic that this was written in, and similar expressions used in Hebrew, are just until the end, when the end comes, whenever that so happens to be. So a lot of this doesn't seem that surprising from sort of like prophetic language or dramatic really in any kind of way, and it seems to be very recognizable really from what we know of the Book of Revelation, which sort of swirls around as inspiration for a lot of both secular and sacred sort of art or literature or that kind of a thing. What's noteworthy here, of course, is there's it's not by accident that this resembles the Book of Revelation, because the Book of Revelation was heavily influenced by the Book of Daniel in its style. So it's not that this is derivative of Revelation, it's that Revelation is derivative of Daniel. And it's in a similar circumstance of trying to write encouragement in coded language through that can be passed through the sort of censor lines of an occupying power, and will be understood to those it hears, or at least encouraging to those who hear it. But the censor and the occupiers won't know what it's talking about and will assume it's just sort of like farce or nonsense or something like that of one kind or another. There are some clearly recognizable characters. First off, it begins with that this is sort of the portents of all of this is the archangel Michael. Then there are references to the other two, which is the other two of this is one of the bases and one of the supports of there being three archangels who are all sort of in their particular roles, but all of them are here in this particular situation. So that's Michael is sort of the master of ceremonies of this event, and then Gabriel, who is named in Scripture, and Raphael, who is not named in Scripture, but is named in the Catholic Apocrypha. So that's the tradition of those three archangels. All of them are here. All of them are part of this. And then there's another character who's over the river at the center of this, who is described as being dressed in linen, which just means that is also an angel. That's the same way an angel is described shortly beforehand, and that's a similar expression. This is also, of course, similar to how the angels that are variously talked about who appear in Jesus's tomb are described, sort of non-specific, but with this sort of like celestial aura around them. So you have this framing of the situation, of this circumstance for this prophecy or prediction or this grand vision to be portrayed. And what you have in particular is this saying of that at an appointed time, at an unknown time, there will be a resurrection of the dead. That is, all those, however deep they are in the dusts of the earth, will rise or be raised in order to be judged. And some will go into eternal punishment for the crimes they have committed, and some will go into eternal sort of glory for the good things they have done, and will be set like the fixed stars as eternal sort of leaders, eternal lodestars, eternal inspiration for all who come afterwards. This is a very ancient Greek kind of perspective. This has a similarity to sort of Aristotle, and shows sort of how deeply intertwined with the Hellenistic world, the occupiers, the occupying Greek community that is the overlords of Judea at this time and against whom they are rebelling. However, there has been an acceptance of a lot of their cultural elements and their philosophical perspectives. This is, in the last chapter of the Old Testament, the last one to be written, the last one to be canonized, the first and only reference to anything like a resurrection. This is a cleared, and this gets lost, of course, in our Bible, where Daniel is kind of in the middle, or sort of like middle end of the Old Testament, and in our whole Bible, it's very much in the middle that Daniel is located. Daniel is not put as being the end of what's going on at all. It's not put in the sort of series of this changing of schools of thought and this moving away from schools of thought that influenced some earlier pieces of Scripture. Though, of course, quite a lot of what's at the very beginning, quite a lot of what's in the Torah is actually from quite late is interpretation that's quite late in the actual timeline of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Hello, how are you doing? We've got just a little bit more to talk about, okay? Just a little bit more. Hey there. So we hear in there a couple of times that Daniel has this sealed book, and it's his responsibility to keep it, because that's sort of the record and the determination and this important message for this end time. And it's not given as being any particular span of time as to when he needs to keep it. It's just he just needs to keep it. That's part of where we get that, and as clearly Jesus also followed on with, that only the Father can know when the end times will come, and there are no sure signs that we can predict that things are immediately coming to pass in that particular way. Now, of course, predicting the apocalypse has been a pretty popular topic, and on a variety of occasions, and unfortunately has now become in the last couple of years, especially last 10 or 20 years, and with some actual actions by U.S. administrations recently, has become a major driving force behind U.S. public policy and international policy. The idea that some steps in particular need to be made in terms of actions by the State of Israel in order to bring about the end times and the return of Christ is a very commonly held belief in leadership in some churches, and it's probably had a significant role in the actions taken by the former Vice President of the United States in sort of some of the diplomatic work that he did and was involved with. And it's almost certainly has something to do with some of the previous administration's actions in terms of Middle East policy. Probably the greatest driving force behind Middle East policy in the last administration was increasing arms sales. This is not controversial or a surprise. It's just simply the case that arms sales were significantly increased, and it's one of the things that's done in the Middle East. However, it needs to be concretely put forward that documents like Daniel, like interpretations of Revelation, that these trying to put direct times and meanings and present day interpretations into these apocalypses, which are these pieces of literature, are these really neat things, really curious and cool to study, and with interesting parallels in contemporary literature, not in contemporary events. We're about to stand and probably about to walk any one of these days. So I'm not sure what's going to happen below the camera frame for you. So the interpretation of these verses and the use of these verses in this sort of curious way, in this particular case, we can be really confident about why the lectionary includes these verses, includes this particular passage, because it's this close parallel to what Jesus is talking about. It's this close parallel to the Mark version, and Mark has some sort of apocalyptic characteristics about it. Mark is always moving on quickly. It's always the urgent business of what needs to be done in the interest of Jesus' mission and ministry. So really because of this, and because of all this sort of controversy, a lot of more serious biblical scholarship just avoids Daniel, simply because there's so much that's more interesting and more helpful to do. And there's maybe even greater controversy. You add an even greater controversy behind that. 200 years ago, Daniel was included as this like strange mystery text to be unlocked. And then in the 20th century, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls found a whole bunch of other similar type of documents. They're from about a similar time period. They're in a similar style. They're written in the same language and the same kind of a text, which makes Daniel not so special anymore. And whenever anything like that happens, whenever anything that was assumed to be extremely special suddenly becomes kind of mundane, there ends up being a huge doubling down by those who found it especially important and for those for whom it was especially important. This is not productive or helpful for our understanding or our wholeness of interpretation, and it is almost certain, and it is certainly a good thing, that there will be more and more significant discoveries regarding that will further enhance our understanding both of the ancient world, of the biblical world, and of biblical texts and texts that we call biblical. We know something about the process of putting together the sacred scriptures. We don't know all of it. We know that it was quite political. You see that in my version here, this is book 3 of just the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible, and Robert Alter organizes things in the traditional way of Hebrew scriptures, which is the Torah, and then the prophets, and then the writings, which is the third book, the smallest book, at the end, and we're quite near the end of that third book. It makes it very clear that Daniel is the end, is one of the last pieces, and actually is one of kind of the least important pieces. It's to give Daniel too much importance, other than as sort of a setting up of the literary and philosophical situation into which Jesus was born and in which he grew up, and to see sort of what a community under duress, what a community under occupation, under sort of having its sort of spiritual identity erased through this sort of cultural overtaking that the dominant Greek culture went through after the conquest of Alexander the Great. Now, the kingdom of Judah welcomed Alexander the Great's conquest, welcomed the turn from the Persian overlords to the Greek overlords. But it was a couple hundred years, and eventually it was the Romans coming along to finally throw out the Greeks. And it was a couple hundred years of really nasty infighting, political and not just political. And eventually the Romans, to some extent, were brought in, or were brought in as an ally to try to play off against the Greeks. And you ended up with the Romans just taking over and having it being an even greater cultural takeover of the community, to the point that after the second Jewish revolt, Jerusalem was basically burned to the ground and rebuilt as a totally different city, and all Jews were prohibited from that day until the end of time to ever set foot in Jerusalem ever again. So this is a couple hundred years after Daniel, but it's the kind of apocalyptic kind of end of the world. How do you go on in the face of these things? And to find that it's the end of one thing without being the end of everything. So what did we do? What did we go forth from there to do? We taught Scripture, we learned Scripture, we stayed in and supported our communities wherever we found ourselves to be, and we found that it was not so much the ritual, not so much the place, not so much the gold and sacred altars, as it was the community, the devotion, and the time that we spend with God. And that is perhaps a very good lesson for this challenge of what we desperately, desperately hope is nearly the end of this pandemic. But however, and in our area, it is the worst period in this pandemic. So friends, stay safe, keep in touch, do good work, and we'll see you again soon. God bless.